Welcome to the podcast. Today I'm joined with Henk Schwietert, the General Manager at Averland and Matej Supej. Thanks for being here, first of all. Today we're going to talk about sensors, data, in particularly in the sports world. Our guest today is Matej. You are a professor at the University of Ljubljana. So first of all, please introduce yourself.
Okay, first, thank you for this invitation. Yes, you are correct. I originally come from University of Ljubljana, Faculty of Sports. I'm a professor for biomechanics and technology. So I'm the head of the Laboratory of Biomechanics. And for this project, Syntec, I'm employed at Mid-Sweden University. I'm working for the Swedish Winter Sport Research Center. So that's my more, I would say, academic background, but otherwise I'm coming more from alpine skiing. So I was an athlete myself, so I'm more from the winter sports, and this is also one of my primary areas of research.
All right, thanks. And what in particularly are you interested in the Sintect project?
Our Syntec project is it's really interesting. So in sport research, we are always trying to move the boundaries, what we can measure, and these really small, tiny, lightweight, smart patches are really one of the exciting things that we are developing in the Syntec, and we are really looking forward how we can use this in different applications and move on with where we are actually stacking now, because there is always limitations with the equipment. How far can you go? And particularly because the Syntec, what we are, these patches that we are developing is a combination of physiology and biomechanics. It gives a new opportunity also about that to have a more integrative approach, having everything packed in a one very small and lightweight sensor.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe to give a bit more information to the listeners, in the Sintec project, we are developing a sensor, a wearable sensor, in a patch which is flexible and stretchable. So it's very durable, especially during sports or active activities. Is that right, Henk?
Yeah, that is correct. So there's a technical innovation, and during the project that will also be used for testing with actual sports people and also in rehabilitation.
Yeah, exactly. So in general, sensors and data is becoming more and more common in sports for consumers like myself. I use my smartwatch during running. I like all the data, but also for professionals. And I am wondering, Matej, is the current state of innovation, are we already is there still a lot on the table in terms of what we can research more, or are we already very far in the development of these sensor and data?
It's always room for improvement. So as I said, if you can create a small lightweight sensor that athletes practically cannot feel it, so they don't even know they're wearing it. So this is something that doesn't interfere with the performance at all. It gives a total new dimension of measurements. And of course, with having this integral approach is for sure another step forward. And sport, as you know, is very much on the limit of what athletes can do, and every small improvements in the either efficiency, either in technique or in tactics, whatever can bring the difference between winning a gold medal on the Olympics or just being off the podium. And you know, everybody would like to have the gold medal.
Yeah, sure. But maybe we can go a bit more in depth in why this data, especially for these professionals, is so important. And maybe to start off with, are all the professional athletes currently gathering data about their performance, or do some people not really believe in it? What's the state of that?
So this is probably a difficult difficult question to answer. So for everyone, but I would say that for sure it is a large majority of the athletes that are helping themselves with this or the other way of measurements. Everything from laboratory testing, from their physiological testing to what they are doing on field during their training. And sometimes now, particularly with this kind of small technology, you can go even further. You can have data during competitions, which is not possible with sensors that are not lightweight and are disturbing the athlete during their performance.
And do you see that already in sports, that people are actually using it during the competition and monitoring themselves and maybe changing their tactics or their approach while they are competing?
So it's in terms of competitions, there are sometimes also the regulations going against that, so that people are not having advantage against that. But you know, until it is forbidden, it is allowed. So.
Yeah. Okay. And which in which areas do you see the biggest potential for improvements or things that can be gained with this type of technology? Is it for endurance, or is it for say posture or positioning, or what is it?
I'm a biomechanist, so from my perspective, for sure, is more on the biomechanical parameters. But I'm quite certain that physiology also have a lot of things to be done, like long-term monitoring. So it's not just something that you do, for example, in this particular period of time when you're doing training, which is of course very important if you have immediate feedback and improve either your tactics or your movements. But in the long term, if you can control what you are doing, it's another advantage. And this kind of sensor technology that can be worn over several days or even weeks or months, and monitoring what is going on, not only with biomechanics but particularly with physiological parameters. I think it's very, very important also to determine, for example, the levels of recovery and these kind of things that are pre-mandatory to have good trainings on the next days.
One of the things I remember you talked about one time was that if an athlete has had an injury and is trying to come back, he struggles or she struggles with getting the same behavior around the sport or posture or the way it's performing the sport as before, because there is a certain fear. Is that something that you're also focusing on in these projects and trying to identify with sensors how that can be improved?
In the project that we have, we are more on the fundamental base. So what are the effects of this? But I would say that more in regular work with the tests that we are doing at the institute and helping athletes, and my role also in the experts board of the Slovenian Ski Association is more associated with these kind of things. What is a safe return to sport when the athlete is capable of going back to let's say the full speed skiing or skiing at all or full training. So it's a lot of questions about that. And one of the things that I see a big potential using this technology is also that if we can have information of the athletes during their normal state, this very much helps if we have an injury, what is really the state after the injury and when is the right time that the athlete is recovered, or at least recovered enough that he can come back. So this is, I would say, it's one of the advantages that I also see as a potential of the new technology.
Yeah, and can the data after an injury, can data really help the patient rehabilitate, or can you see when the patient is fully rehabilitated to go into the competition again?
I think it's both. It is during the rehabilitation, you can see what is going on. I mean, it comes from a very simple thing. So, for example, in alpine skiing, you have a lot of knee injuries, and this induces asymmetries in also very regular movements like walking and running. And if you can have a monitoring in these very basic movements, this can for sure, I believe, or I can strongly convinced that it can help you to improve faster, so that you have an instant feedback, that you know what is going on, and then you can control your body movements. Because I would say, I'm not an expert in that area, but in a way you lose also a little bit the feeling of if you're symmetric or not. So it's very difficult on your own to know that. But if you have an external objective measure of this can for sure help you a lot.
You just mentioned also something about there's a difference between what you can measure in the lab and what's actually being done on the snow or in action. Is that something that you feel is that the technologies are being adapted to create a better picture of that, making those differences smaller, so being better able to find out in a lab what's really going on in the field, or is that not the objective of those types of these types of studies?
I would say it's a mix. It depends a little bit on the sport. So there are some sports, what you can do in the laboratory is very similar to real competition environment. So for example, you can do quite a lot of athletics in a hall in the laboratory when you have everything available and you do the tests, and those tests are pretty much the same as you can do it on the competitions. But there are some outdoor sports, for example, alpine skiing, which is very difficult to do anything that mimics alpine skiing in the laboratory. So what you do in the lab is maybe physiological testing and this kind of stuff, like physical abilities, balance, but then when you go on snow, it's an entirely different thing. Maybe cross-country skiing is a little bit closer, because you can do, let's say, fairly well roller ski skating on the big treadmills, and that's much more comparable to what you can do also on the snow. I mean, comparing to alpine skiing, which is practically impossible.
Yeah. And how do you think the future will look like? Will people be wearing more and more sensors and collecting more data during the sports and afterwards as well, or what is your prediction?
It's a tough question. I mean, there are athletes also that they don't use much, and they can be really on the elite level. And there are athletes that needs this a lot. So I would say that the technology will for sure change the sport. And I mean, it's changing already in a lot of areas. And probably I would say, as on the beginning, the majority of the athletes will be using, because this gives an advantage of having an appropriate, an objective feedback to what you are doing.
Yeah,
and that's for sure an important thing for sport.
Yeah, but could it also be that people are going to focus too much on the data and the details, and they lose focus on they're going to trust the facts too much? Maybe that's also could also cause a bad effect.
Yeah, you mentioned two actually different things. One is that if you're measuring something, you need to have valid and reliable measurements. So that's one part. So if you have valid and reliable measurements, And if you can have interpretation of this data that is correct, so then this data is correct. So there is no doubt about that. So it's just, it can be too much data. And this is one of the problems that we experience sometimes. So I do a lot of tests, for example, with alpine skiers, and we can retrieve really a lot of information from their skiing on the slope during their training. And then at the end, you of course see a lot of things that happened and a lot of parameters that changed, and you can tell them really a lot of things. But if you want to give them a feedback on today's training and they need to improve something for tomorrow, it's maybe 1, 2 things. 3 is too much, because you cannot go to the start and think about 3 different things and improve them. So it's you need to focus, and that's one of very important things. To know where to put the focus after having so much data.
Well, this is the last question would be, I think, about data-driven decision making. So you mentioned that already to some extent, that you say there's a lot of data, we get a lot of information, and then how do we translate that into advice, for the specific training of tomorrow? And I think that if you look in the world of business and industry, you see a very significant trend towards, okay, decisions are made more based on data because there's more data available, and people recognize that sometimes what they think is the real focus is actually different if you really look at the data. And I'm just curious about your views on that. If you see that in sports as well, that people are more relying on it in setting their objectives or their plans for the trainings, or if that's something that's still, there's still a big gap between what happens in practice there and what people can do in research.
I think the data is very important, and it's used a lot in sport. I mean, when you face an athlete with an objective parameter and you compare, I will show you this or demonstrate you this on a simple case in alpine skiing. I mean, if you compare 2 athletes on the same spot in alpine skiing, and one is skiing 36 kilometers an hour and another one is 40 kilometers an hour, and then one is increasing speed, another one is losing speed, and these kind of things, and then you show them why this is happening. I mean, if you have this kind of objective data, I mean, they have to believe it. And the reality is that this kind of data, when you provide them, can be really used very fast. So I had experience also not only with elite athletes, but on junior athletes, and we were doing measurements like that. And I could say that after providing them a feedback in the evening, it was a totally new picture on the next day, because sometimes they're listening to their coaches, years and years with the same thing, and then you show them the data, you show them the videos synchronized with the data, and then they have eyes suddenly like that, and you see them that, they became believers. I mean, the data is really important, and it helps a lot in decisions what to do, not just for the coaches, but particularly for the athletes, because they have their own feelings and sometimes they just don't believe it.
Yeah, the data doesn't lie.
Yeah. It's hard to argue, I mean, objective data.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for your knowledge and your time. And perhaps we'll talk to you later again.
Okay, thank you for this invitation again. It was nice being with you and discussing these very interesting aspects of sport.
Likewise.
Yeah, thank you. And of course, we work together in the Sintect Project, and that will be going on for a few more years. So I think we'll get to some very interesting and new results as well there.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that for sure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.